At the Mountains of Madness, for beginning readers, by R. J. Ivankovic. I am forced into speech, and I warn you, take heed, as the threat I'm describing is dire indeed. The Antarctic's a place that you don't want to go. Having been there myself, please believe me, I know. I'm aware how exciting the science must seem. For myself it was just like fulfilling a dream. We'd discover great things I'd no reason to doubt, when the ships Miskatonic and Arkham set out. As our doomed expedition set course and made sail, I could not have imagined how badly we'd fail. I had gone to take samples from under the ice with Professor Frank Pabodi's wondrous device. And the rocks I collected were so very old they'd been buried before the Antarctic was cold. After digging up samples for over a week, our biologist Lake had come down for a peek. When he picked up a rock, the professor cried out, "These are footprints, I tell you! Of that I've no doubt!" This presented a puzzle that couldn't be solved. They'd been made before creatures with feet had evolved. I discussed it with Lake as he wanted to try to uncover more proof in deposits nearby. So believing the rocks there would suit him the best, he took half our party and headed northwest. But the hunt for more fossils did not go as planned. Moulton's engine malfunctioned and forced him to land. They decided to camp near a vast mountain range that had risen before them, majestic and strange. With the landscape aglow in a golden red light, they had surveyed the mountains and guessed at their height. The group also observed that the ice there was thin. After drilling and blasting, the ground had caved in. Lake reported by radio what he had found while exploring a cave in the long frozen ground. There were dozens of samples all over the floor, and on one side sat fossils of 8 feet or more. He'd recovered 14 of the strange elder things, with their barrel-shaped bodies and membranous wings. They had starfish-shaped heads and triangular feet, and they'd slowly thawed out when exposed to the heat. An attempted dissection did not go so well, and the dogs had gone crazy on smelling their smell. Having drawn up some plans for our own westward flight, we all said our farewells and turned in for the night. Though he'd promised a radio after daybreak, as you know, there was no further contact from Lake. When his silence convinced me that something was wrong, we were fueled for a rescue before very long. As we took to the skies with incredible haste, I took note of the mountains dividing the waste. In the peaks of that range, like a trick of the light, many hundreds of structures had come into sight. I was certain the vision was something I'd dreamed. It just couldn't be real. At least, that's how it seemed. When at last we arrived in the spare aeroplane, we were met by a scene that was truly insane. We saw things that we knew we could never reveal, and the truth, we agreed, we would need to conceal. So, inventing a simple, conventional tale, we reported the camp was destroyed by a gale. The horrific events that occurred overnight we have kept from the public to spare them the fright, so I urge you abandon that long frozen land and the Starkweather Moor expedition you've planned. Now with total repugnance I'm forced to recall and explain what we found at Lake's camp to you all. Just exactly what happened was anyone's guess. Some equipment was missing. The camp was a mess. All the men and their dogs had been torn into shreds, both dissected and salted, right there in their beds. When we'd counted the dead, there was one absentee. Quite suspiciously missing was Mr. Gedney. As we searched high and low and all over the place, we discovered 6 graves had been dug at the base, and inside of each grave a dead elder thing lay, but we'd little idea how they'd gotten that way. We began to think maybe that Gedney went mad, that the sight of the elder things made him go bad. But as true men of science we couldn't ignore the great mountains beyond and our chance to explore. A reconnaissance plane that went up for a look had reported strange shapes in each cranny and nook. On the following flight, Mr. Danforth and I had flown over the peaks when we took to the sky. It was then we discovered a long-lost plateau and a city half buried in deep ice and snow. The great city was ancient, impossibly vast, and abandoned some time in the long-distant past. The colossal remains of the petrified place bore the symbols and shapes of a long-absent race. For example, where clearly some water once flowed, unexplainable towering columns still showed. We decided, of course, we would need to go down and take copious notes on that Antarctic town. Once we'd landed, we saw it was not very far to a 5-pointed building that looked like a star. Over millions of years, it had filled up with snow, which prevented us accessing chambers below. Quite a lot of the city was frozen like this, when the crystal-clear ice had filled up the abyss. So we walked through the city in search of a door that might let us inside to more deeply explore. But as Danforth and I took our tour of the past, I believed he was losing his sanity fast. As we searched the cold streets of Cyclopean stone, I suspected his nerves were more strained than my own. He insisted he saw a faint trail on the ground, and could hear in the distance a musical sound. When we came to a wall where a hole opened wide, this allowed us to access the secrets inside. We were nervous, of course, but we gritted our teeth and descended down into the city beneath. At the top of the structure the rooms were still bright. As we made our way downwards, we lost all the light. We dropped pieces of paper to help find our way while exploring that maze on that terrible day. We found windows and rooms sealed with petrified wood and began taking notes on whatever we could. We took photos which used up the film that we had, and I'm glad, as without them you'd think I was mad. All the walls had been carved with amazing reliefs, and the details won't fit with your current beliefs. There were star charts and myths, and most probably more on those murals that stretched between ceiling and floor. But they also confirmed what we'd come to suspect, that the thing we feared most was exactly correct. In the depths of that tower the light of my lamp revealed carvings of creatures like those at Lake's camp. It was they who'd created the artworks we saw, the strange artworks not seen by a human before. They'd recorded a story told long before man. Though I don't know it all, I'll recount what I can. There were eons of history up on each wall, and the things they revealed will amaze and appall. At the moment I just want to give you the gist. When it's published you'll pick up the details I've missed. Many hundreds of millions of years have gone by since the old ones crossed space and came out of the sky. When the creatures arrived here they went straight to work, building cities way down in the deep ocean's murk. But they didn't use tractors and didn't have cranes. See, they utilized creatures with hypnotized brains. These were blobs, protoplasmic, with many green eyes on their amorphous bodies of prodigious size. You'll find them called Shoggoths, if daring to look for a mention of them in Alhazred's old book. When they later got hungry and thinking of food, well, the elder things got in a life-making mood. So they took a few chemicals, mixed them all up using measured amounts in a measuring cup. Then they stirred the concoction and gave it a spark, thus creating new life in the deep ocean's dark. They made creatures for labour and some just to eat, which included a simian prized for its meat. And those monkeys evolved from back then till today just because they'd behaved and stayed out of the way. Once their cities were full and they had to expand, they moved out of the oceans and onto dry land. Just as life settled down for the Elder Thing race, the star-spawn of Cthulhu had squirmed out of space. Then a war had begun for control of the Earth, and the two races fought it for all they were worth. But they fought to a stalemate and had to declare that the planet was something they'd just have to share. While I'm sure there are details I happen to miss, the agreement they came to went something like this. If the old ones returned to their most ancient homes and then settled down under their undersea domes, then their Antarctic cities could stay where they were. Of course, wanting to keep them, they had to concur. And the Starspawn, of course, had been guaranteed land for the incomprehensible things they had planned. At the time, a great continent rose from the sea in a place where one day the Pacific would be, and the pre-human spawn of Cthulhu agreed that this new land would suit them quite nicely indeed. The Cthulhuds, of course, aren't around anymore, and their stone city R'lyeh sits on the sea floor. The new continent sank with the passage of time and was lost to the dark and the deep ocean's slime. So once more life returned to a casual pace for the slowly diminishing Elder Thing race. Then a problem arose that they didn't expect, when the Shoggoths stopped showing them any respect. It occurred once the Shoggoths had laboured so long they'd developed ideas about rights and what's wrong. Over millions of years they had learned to rebel and had started to think for themselves then as well. The intractable Shoggoths were put in their place when they started to threaten the Elder Thing race. Their rebellion was squashed as a matter of course, with the power of anti-molecular force. Their next struggle began when the Migo arrived, an event that the Elder Things barely survived. An unfortunate truth that the conflict revealed was a change in their bodies that couldn't be healed. See, the comfort that having a home planet brings had stagnated their spacefaring, membranous wings. They discovered their empire came at a cost, as their freedom to travel the cosmos was lost. An attempted expansion was brought to a halt by the constant attacks of the Migo assault. Then the Old Ones were driven from lands in the north, and the Migo prevented them venturing forth. As the years slowly passed, the Antarctic grew cold, and unable to take the spaceways of old, they sought out an abyss where the water was nice, while the city above was consumed by the ice. While we paused for a moment to ponder their fate, as this wasn't recorded, and caused some debate, we detected the faint smell of spilled gasoline, which revealed the direction that someone had been. Having sniffed out the vapour, we came to a room and discovered a campsite set up in the gloom. What we saw on the floor with our very own eyes was a pile of our own expedition supplies, an abandoned inkwell, a few empty tin cans, and some scraps of torn paper with alien plans. We could recognise structures and pathways we'd been, and the symbols resembled the carvings we'd seen. It was clear that whoever spilled gas on the ground had been stopped by some rubble and then turned around. When we traced where they went, we arrived in a space, a huge empty and open cylindrical place. A great spiralling ramp wound its way up the hall, and small exits were spaced out around a great hall. At the base of the ramp was a left-behind sled, and beneath a tarpaulin poor Gedney lay, dead. As a sledge dog had also been neatly preserved, we presumed they'd been stored to be studied, observed. We were taken aback by the horror we'd found, but were coaxed to go on upon hearing a sound. I'll be brief in describing the noise that we heard, which was clearly the squawking of some sort of bird. But the penguins we found were exceedingly strange, all albino and blind, in the 6-foot-tall range. We deduced they'd been scared up from somewhere below, and this helped us decide which direction to go. In the tunnel we chose, which was clear of debris, all the walls we observed were carved decadently. There were sections of tunnel incredibly steep, and two mingling odours increased in the deep. We arrived in a star-spangled carved hemisphere where the path to the waiting abyss was quite clear. While malodorous vapours assaulted my nose, with each step that we stumbled the temperature rose. It had gotten so hot we unbuttoned our gear, and the Old Ones, it seemed, had the self-same idea. We descended through caverns and tunnels and caves in the honeycombed space of the elder things' graves. Then the decadent artworks we'd recently passed were replaced by strange carvings of primitive cast. They were clearly inspired by earlier art, but an alien something now set them apart. We had started to notice the faraway sound of a chorus of penguins still deep underground. As a thickening vapour appeared in the air, the still worsening odour became hard to bear. When the mist slowly thinned to dramatic effect, we were met by a horror we didn't expect. A small pile of dead elder things lay on the floor. We believed they'd been 8, but we saw only 4. At the sight of those old ones I felt really sad. They had come to an end, undeniably bad. After millions of years frozen under the snow, they woke up in a time that they just didn't know. They'd returned to the mountains they'd thought of as home, to find igneous ruins and dark honeycomb. They'd become merely strangers lost in a strange time, then were decapitated and covered in slime. See, the elder things just did what I would have done, so although I am a human and not an old one, I could give them my sympathy right there and then, for they weren't only old ones, they also were men. It was then Danforth let out a nerve-tortured cry, and beyond the pale mist a voice wailed in reply. When the voice started calling out, "Tekeli Lee!" you will not be surprised we decided to flee. We began our retreat, not a word was exchanged. It approached us so quickly the air pressure changed. We were conscious, of course, of the missing old ones, and when thinking like that, my, how quickly one runs. With increasing exhaustion, we couldn't resist looking over our shoulders back into the mist. We were taken aback by the shape that appeared, as it wasn't the elder things that we both feared. It is still very difficult just to explain what came out of that dark like a passenger train. The analogy came to us both on that day. It approached like a train in the Boston subway. It had glowed from within, phosphorescently green, the bizarrest of conjuries I've ever seen. With impermanent mouths and ephemeral eyes, a great Shoggoth was chasing us, to our surprise. In delirious panic we fled from the shape, putting penguins between us to hide our escape. As it slithered towards us, the poor birds were crushed. They were squawking behind us, while onward we rushed. Having backtracked as far as the spiralling ramp, we then climbed it by light of electrical lamp. Our one thought was escape on that terrible day, so were forced to leave Gedney right there where he lay. Looking back on it now, it all seems like a dream, and I know just how crazy the whole thing must seem. We emerged from below the pale midnight sun, and from there to the plain was just a short run. When we took to the skies, I gave Danforth a break, and I took the controls for his sanity's sake. But the poor man had suffered a terrible fright when the distant horizon came into his sight. Mr. Danforth looked back at the mountains behind and saw something your next expedition will find. The strange atmosphere there had behaved like a lens and reflected a vision his mind cannot cleanse. I can't tell you exactly just what it might be. He just says he saw something that I didn't see. There are times, though, when talking about the South Pole he becomes irresponsible, loses control. He will carelessly whisper of disjointed things, irrespective of any derision it brings. He's described a strange cylinder without a name. Of the Elder Pharos, a description once came. Then a black pit, white jelly, the colour from space, and the old carven rim, and the old Shoggoth race. He once spoke of the moon ladder, eyes in the dark, 5-dimensional solids, all windowless, stark. He has mentioned Yog-Sothoth, something with wings, and eternal, original, undying things. When he's fully himself, he'll deny it, of course. He will argue a book he'd once read was the source. For the old Necronomicon, he'd read it all, in the college's library just down the hall. He had studied that book in his earlier years, and he claims it gave names to his Antarctic fears. He'll explain how the strain and the things that he'd read had inspired the vision still haunting his head. To be clear, though today he'll discuss the bizarre, and will hint at that something he glimpsed from afar, at the time Danforth spoke with an insanity, simply shrieking repeatedly, "Tekeli! Lee!"